Many people call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires. Why is that? And does it really deserve it? Let's find out. Hello Internet, welcome to Lex Universe. Have you been watching news lately? Well, if you're watching this in real time, then I suppose so, because otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. But if you're here and you want to see more info about the recent events that are going on in Afghanistan and in Kabul, I have to disappoint you. I will possibly touch it in the end, but that's not what this video will be about. We will look more at the background of Afghanistan. I will talk about what are the biggest problems of Afghanistan itself, why it is such a problematic country, and why many people have called it the graveyard of empires. So if you are interested in that, well, let's start. When we talk about Afghanistan, let's explain a few terms first, because I will be using them throughout this video and it's good to understand it. But to understand the terms, you will need to know something about history. So let's explore the history of Afghanistan very quickly, because then it will give you more context about what I will be explaining in the later part of the video. Afghanistan has been invaded by many other empires around. There were Persians in the ancient times. Alexander the Great also tried his own. Actually, like the city of Kandahar was founded by him. There were the Arabs and the Mongols. Of course, there were Mongols. They have tried to invade everything in this continent. Then there were attempts to conquer the country from the British side, and we are now getting to the modern history of Afghanistan, which is really messy. Well, in 1747, the kingdom or the empire of Afghanistan was established. They had their own king. Actually, this kingdom lasted for over 200 years, and the descendants of the royal family still live today in the United States, so it would be possible to meet someone who is still the pretendant of the Afghan throne. But, well, things didn't work out very well. In the 60s, there was a revolution that was actually kind of bloodless, which is kind of interesting when you think about Afghanistan, but there will be more surprising facts. They created the Republic of Afghanistan, which lasted really not long and was very unpopular among the people. Then the communists came and they created their own Bolshevik revolution. They overthrew the government. They created the communist Afghanistan. But let's stop in the 60s for a bit, because it will give you a bit of understanding what we are talking about here. When we say Afghanistan or Kabul today, this is what we see. Explosions, poor people on the streets. Well, that's not the Afghanistan of the 60s. Kabul is actually, I would say, like the Paris of Central Asia. It was a very modern, very liberal city. The Republic of Afghanistan actually really forced this separation of the church, or in this case, mosque, and the state. The society was very liberal. Women were not forced to wear any scarves. Well, this kind of caused the problem in the first place, because when we talk about Kabul, it was really kind of modern. It was kind of almost like an European city, but you couldn't say the same thing about the rest of the country. It was still very rural. The illiteracy rate was around 90%, so almost nobody in the country could write or read, which was kind of problematic if you want to modernize the whole nation. Not to mention then, in opposition with the liberal city of Kabul and some other major population centers, the countryside was a lot more conservative and did a lot more dive into the Islamic society. It did cause some tension, but it still didn't end up in a conflict. That happened after the declaration of the communist Afghanistan, when the new overlords of the country really tried to push the new communist agenda towards all the people. There was a very strong pushback against the Islamic society and against the religion, and the socialism and communism should be the new religion of the country. I will discuss this a little bit more, but this was the major problem that happened in Afghanistan, and it really has been affecting the country ever since. Well, as you can see, country did have problems in the 70s when the communists were in charge. You can imagine there was a very strong backlash from the conservative countryside, since they didn't really like the liberal republic that wasn't that anti-clerical. They really hated these new communist leaders. At the end of the 70s, the country was almost at the state of a civil war. The Islamist fundamentalists in the mountain regions and in the countryside have been practicing for war for quite some time. They are the ones that we now call mujahideen, and they were very effective in fighting with the government. It looked like the communist government was no longer able to control the entirety of the country. That's when the Soviets came and tried to help them. This was one of the many invasions that happened in Afghanistan, and it's actually one of the reasons why people still call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires. Because if you have learned anything from history, this invasion didn't really end up very well. The Red Army remained in Afghanistan for almost 8 years, and honestly, it didn't make much difference. They managed to keep the communist government in power, sort of, but at that time it didn't really control the entirety of the country. Well, as the history goes, so did the Soviet Union go. They left Afghanistan in 1989, which is another reason why this year is amazing, apart from me being born and, well, I don't know, beer on Iceland being no longer banned. So it was a great thing. The problem is, the country was so divided at the moment that it didn't really know how to operate anymore. They formed this coalition government that was very weak. It didn't really have control over the territory. At that time, several of these mujahideens joined forces with the students or talibs from madrasas in Pakistan, and they formed the movement that we now call Taliban. This was in 1994. By the way, Taliban is actually plural in English, but it's singular in my own language, so sometimes I will be using it wrongly. Don't kill me for that. It's really probably not that important, but you know. So this Taliban crossed borders from Pakistan, and they started their own offensive against the weak government that was in Kabul. And they got to Kabul in 1996. They conquered it quite quickly, and at that moment they were the leaders of Afghanistan. But even then, when they created the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which really was only internationally recognized by some 3 countries, and they started very isolationist politics. They closed their country. They ruled really ruthlessly at that moment. It was like the top level of autocracy, totalitarian regime that thought that human rights were optional. They have ruled Afghanistan for 5 years, till 2001, when it was invaded by the United States. After that, several other pro-American governments were formed, and that leaves us with the day when, well, nobody knows what will come. In this video, I want to point out 3 major problems with Afghanistan. These problems are one of the reasons why this country never worked, why it never was actually a country in the sense, and why it is almost impossible to conquer. So let's dive in. So let's start with saying where Afghanistan actually is. It's located right in the middle of Asia. Some people actually call it the heart of Asia. So it's landlocked, it's located really deep within the Asian continent, and that creates its own problems. I will discuss it a little bit later, but so that we know where it is. The problem number 1, Afghanistan is actually kind of an artificial project. Most of the state borders in the Middle East and in Africa and also somewhere else in the world are created very artificially. Here in Europe, the state borders usually have some historic background, and even that never stopped the European countries being at war with each other constantly over the past 2000 years. What is different in the Middle East, or Central Asia in this case, is that these borders are extremely artificial. They have been drawn in London, in Paris, somewhere, without actually giving second thought what this will cause. When you look at this demographic map of Afghanistan, you can see several colors. Each color represents one of the ethnic groups in Afghanistan. As you can see, the largest part of the population is this brownish color in the south of the country. These are the Pashtun. They are the largest, I don't want to say majority because they don't have a majority in the country, but they are the largest minority in Afghanistan. Then, marked with green, there are the Tajik. They're basically brothers of their relatives living in Tajikistan. Then this yellow area in the middle, these are the Hazara people. They are basically Persians living in Afghanistan. Then there are of course other minorities like the Uzbeks and Turkmen in the north of the country, or the Baluch people in the Balochistan in the very south of Afghanistan, and then there are the Nuristani and Pashai people living in the east of the country. When you look at this map, you can see that there is a reason why Afghanistan is sometimes called the Switzerland of Asia. Because this is really complex, but it gets even worse. Because when we look at this other map, we see the ethnic groups of Afghanistan in larger context. As you can see, the largest area and also the largest portion of the population are the Pashtun. They speak the Pashto language, which is one of the two official languages of Afghanistan, and they form a large proportion of population and territory of Pakistan just across the border. The problem is that the Pashtun people living in Afghanistan have a lot more common with the Pashtun people living in Pakistan than with the rest of their own country. And their identity is more related to their ethnic group than some artificial concept of Afghani nationality. And this is the same case for other ethnic groups. As you can see, the Turkmen, Uzbek and the Tajik people living in the north are pretty much the same ethnic groups that live across the border. Today there are the countries of Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And then the third largest ethnic group is the Hazara people, who are basically Persian, and they are very closely related to people living in Iran. And also, again, they have a lot more common with them than with the rest of Afghanistan. So right here you have an artificial state that has borders that are kind of randomly decided. Just look at this panhandle located in the very east of the country. That was created only to create a buffer zone between British India and Russian Empire. It has no connection to Afghanistan, it's just there. And basically every portion of the state border of Afghanistan is pretty much of the same artificial kind. So what is actually the unifying element here in Afghanistan? Well, that would be Islam. The real majority of people living in Afghanistan, and I would say almost 100%, are Muslim. So that's something that really unifies everyone living in the country. But it kind of unifies them with the rest of the Islamic world, so it's not very strong. But it is at least something. The problem that came in the 60s and in the 70s is when the governments really tried to religionize the country, they kind of took them the only unifying thing that was making Afghanistan kind of work. And that didn't work out very well, did it? But this cultural division kind of brings me to the second point why Afghanistan is such a mess. And that's its geography. When you take a look at the topographic map of Afghanistan, you can see that it's really beautiful, by the way. It looks like a leaf, especially with all the mountains in the center. But you can see that it's a very mountainous country. When we take a look at the central Afghanistan and mostly at the eastern portion of the country, you can find there the Hindu Kush mountain range, which is formed by very tall mountain peaks. So that kind of creates its own physical barrier. But more importantly, many people there live in these valleys that are really accessible only by a very small number of passes that you can very easily defend or, well, block if you want to, I don't know, make someone starve to death. Many people who live in these valleys, in the mountains, they have their own loyalty towards their tribe, towards their village, but they really don't care about what is going on in Kabul. And honestly, Kabul, or the central government of Afghanistan, doesn't really have any way how to control these valleys if they don't want it. That's a problem that actually will probably rise even for Taliban now. We say now that they control Afghanistan, but honestly, what it really means is it controls main population centers. But there is a lot of room for anyone, for any insurgency that will want to hide in the mountains, because, well, that's what Taliban did 20 years ago. That's one of the reasons why Taliban was never pushed away or destroyed during the 20 years of the war. It does work for the benefit of Afghanistan when someone wants to conquer it or when someone wants to attack it. But it also makes any kind of centralized government in Afghanistan almost impossible, because there will always be some parts of Afghanistan that you cannot just simply control from Kabul, especially when you think about that there is almost no infrastructure. The entirety of Afghanistan, which is pretty much the same size as France, had only 50 kilometers of paved roads in 2001. That's totally insane. So what can you do? Imagine that you are the Afghan president or someone in Kabul and you want to control the country. How do you do that? There's like no internet connection in these valleys. There is sometimes not even electricity. You cannot drive there because there are no roads. And everybody in this country has a gun and they will protect the few passes that there are leading to their valleys. Which means you have no way of controlling them. And you cannot fly there because there are 7,000 meters high mountains around. So a helicopter would just like crash into it. So it's really difficult to get anyone, especially here in the mountain region, to listen to anything that the government in Kabul does or says. The thing about geography brings me to the third problem of Afghanistan. This one actually kind of works for Afghanistan, but if you want to conquer it, you may end up in a problem. And that's one of the reasons why it's been called the graveyard of empires for quite some time. When you look at this topographic map of Afghanistan, imagine that you want to conquer it. How you do it? Well, don't do it from the Chinese side. There is Pamir and there is Hindu Kush. You cannot cross it. I'm sorry. So, the borders of Afghanistan are basically protected by mountains. So, you will need to get some pass. Let me show you an example of the Khyber Pass, which is one of the main border crossings with Pakistan. Since Pakistan has built their own fence at the borders of Afghanistan, you can cross simply anywhere you wanted, which was possible 20 years ago. That's what all the Taliban did. But now, if you want to cross into the country, this pass is one of your very few options, and if someone blocks it, you cannot get in and you cannot get out. And it's such a choke point that conquering it without a very significant air force is very complicated. So it's really easy to defend the country. The other problem why it's so difficult to conquer Afghanistan, and it's one of the reasons why the US stayed for 20 years in the country and they actually in the end haven't accomplished that much, is the one that I mentioned before. You will still have some armed forces that will be somewhere in the mountains, and as we have learned something about history, is the guerrilla fighters are very effective because they know that terrain, they have a very good reason why to fight. And if you have a terrain like in Afghanistan, it's very easily defended and you can only do this much to fight it. Also, if you want to control all of these valleys, you would need such a large army. And then let's ask ourselves, is this what you want? Do you want to put millions of soldiers into one country? For what reason? What would be the point? Want to bring their democracy, then don't create a military state. See? So that's a major problem of Afghanistan actually. How does this all that I have described affect the recent events? The fall of Kabul to the hands of Taliban and the withdrawal of almost every Westerner living in Afghanistan. One of the reasons why Taliban was so effective against the Afghan army is because the Afghan army doesn't really exist. It was a thought, it was an idea, but when you think about it and when you think about what I said, any kind of Afghan national identity is so artificial and, well, honestly, almost non-existent. These people have their loyalty to their tribe, to their village, to their region, to their ethnic group, why should you fight for something that you don't even believe in? But honestly, in the end, I believe that the same problem that I described will be for the Taliban as well. They will be unable to hold the country by force. It is not possible. So either they will have real support from people, and since you could see what the people were doing to get out of Kabul, I don't think they had such a large support among people. So I will not predict what the future will be, but I'm a little bit worried that this is not the end of the story of Afghanistan and of the mess that we have been seeing for the past 60 years. So I kind of try to answer why Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires, but the more important question is, should it be called that? Because when you think about it, it has always been part of some other empire. Granted, not for very long, maybe, but it was still conquered by the Mongols, it was conquered by the Soviets, by the Arabs. That's how they got Islam. And none of the empires actually collapsed after they left, except for the Soviet Union, but there were many other reasons why that happened. So I guess in the end, maybe we are just overreacting. Maybe the nickname is really uncalled for. So, but what do you think? Is it fitting? What are your thoughts about Afghanistan? Have you ever had interest in the country? Do you want to visit it? I definitely really want. There are some beautiful national parks in the Pamir and the Hindu Kush mountains, and the culture itself is really cool. I think I'll just probably wait some time. It's not the best season to visit Afghanistan, I suppose. So, what do you think about the recent events that unfolded there? Did it surprise you? It did surprise me. And I think I wasn't the only one. If you found this video interesting and you enjoyed it to some degree, consider subscribing to my channel, give me a like, check out my other social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and I will see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.